Hey everybody, this is Kubernetes SIG architecture meeting for May 30th, 2024. Let me share the agenda and we'll get started. We just have two items on the agenda, and I wasn't sure, Tim, I didn't hear back from you whether you were prepared to talk about this or it's been on the list for a while and we've sort of flirted with it. I don't know if now's the right time. It's a lot going on, but there's always a lot going on. So, but sorry, I didn't show it yet.
Sorry, I lost the window. I don't have anything prepared, but it's really a topic for discussion. So if people feel like we're ready to discuss it, I'm happy to discuss.
Sorry, I showed the wrong window. There we go. So, all right, well, let's start with CC's item. CC?
Hello, can anyone hear me?
Yes.
Thank you. My internet has been super poor since this morning. Okay, cool. Like today, I want to brought this to the SIGART's attention about the retrospective on the off by default beta APIs. So as everyone aware of, like since Kubernetes 1.24, we had a policy change from the on by default to off by default for the beta APIs. And our feature, the validated admission policy, just happened to be the first feature affected by this change. So I just want to bring this topic into SIG Arch attention on like the like how that impacted the feature adoption and testing and stuff, and if this is designed or if anything we could do to make it like better. So basically, the features which involved the beta APIs now has to wait until GA to be able to on by default, and most of the users tends to wait till the feature goes to GA to start to try it on, which really lost opportunity of explosion. So we run into like issues which could be fixed easily before GA, and now it's way more complicated to get it fixed and get a user like adopt the fix and stuff.
Do you see, based on some of the comments here?
So
oh, sorry, I thought you were pausing. Go ahead.
Oh, sorry, my connection is poor, maybe.
Go ahead then. Let me stop.
Yeah, so then like the user has to turn on the both API and the feature gate to be able to try the feature on, which also cause like the which also be a blocker for the adoption. Yeah, I listed a couple examples of the issues we received, and that's basically the summary.
So the question that I have is, do you see any path short of enabling by default? Like basically, is the issue that it was a little bit difficult, you had to hit two knobs, or is the issue nobody wants to touch any knob, and the only way for us to get feedback is to have something always present by default?
It's kind of both. I think people tend, like, of course, like more people will start trying on like the G features than like the users who would willing to try the beta features, which require additional setup and stuff. Yeah, that's one thing. And
We lost her again.
We lost
Yeah.
CC, yeah.
hello?
Hey, there you are.
You're going in.
Yeah,
Sorry.
I'm sorry. The connection is not stable, I guess. Yeah, so I was talking about like it's kind of both. It's always been more users willing to try the on by default features than the users wanted to try the off by default features with a lot of like configuration needed. And also like the fact that users has to turn on both API settings and the feature gate settings is also a blocker for especially the managed cluster.
Okay.
I mean,
I think Tim Hawken was next.
Oh, sorry, I didn't see their hands. Go ahead.
Damn it, Jordan. So I think it's worth going back to the beginning of why did we make this change? And I think, tell me if I'm mischaracterizing it, but I think the part of the reason here is to prevent users from accidentally assuming that beta APIs or GA APIs or treating them as if they're GA APIs, only to have us either rip them away or change them or just have them not be well implemented. And to avoid some of the perma beta issues that we had with Ingress and others. But it is inconsistent with respect to beta fields in existing APIs, right? Those are still enabled by default modulo feature gates, but most of the beta feature gates are on by default. So if I add a so-called beta field to a GA API, that's on by default, and a user can go play with that. And if I want to use a different API resource, well, they can't use that because that's in a beta API group. So I find that inconsistency to be somewhat jarring. And I wonder, sorry, caveat, I talked to CC about this last week too. So I've been thinking about it all week. I wonder if there's a different way to approach to get the same result of not letting users accidentally use betas without having it be this big hit. That's all for me.
Tim Allclair.
Yeah, I have talked to Tim Hawken about this a bunch. I can't remember how much we've discussed it in SIG architecture, but there's kind of this idea that like, Tim, I think you first raised this to me of like, all that really matters in Kubernetes, it seems like, is on by default, off by default. And I feel like this is another place where sort of like we all know what alpha means and we know what GA means, and beta is this kind of like weird limbo state between the two, and we treat it, yeah, I guess inconsistently. Sometimes things are on by default, sometimes things are off by default. We've seen beta feature gates off by default, which is a problem. And like, do we need to just go to the preview GA model instead of alpha beta GA and kind of carefully consider what it means for something to turn on by default? I feel like this is another place where we're kind of running into that.
I think I was
Jordan next, yeah.
Adding on to what Tim Hawken was saying, I think there's one other dimension for the not having things new beta APIs on by default, and that's being on by default carries an expectation that we won't break stuff. And no matter what we say, if it's there by default, people expect a thing that worked previously to keep working exactly the same way in the next release, even if working in the same way is problematic. Like we discover things during beta that like, oh, we forgot to bound this, or this isn't safe this way, or it's unbounded cost, or whatever the thing is, and fixing that is a breaking change. And we've tried very hard to say, like, this is beta, it's not GA. You know, these behaviors may change, and every time we tighten things up in beta, people scream bloody murder. And we have to, in some cases, we have to carry those sort of holes forward into the GA because people are so entrenched in not being broken. So I mean, that even some of the things mentioned here are good examples of the types of things that just because we discovered them during beta, I don't think we would have been like, oh yeah, we'll just break it in the same way. I don't know.
Looks like Jordan and I intersected my chat message and his verbal message, but I think Tim Auclair, related to what you just said, I think what we just saw here, the initial comment from CC, is we had a 2-level thing. We had the off and then we had the on, and we aren't happy with that outcome. And yeah, I mean, I guess I don't know how we would be happy other than be more perfect. But I guess I would say I think we tried that here, and CC's telling us it didn't work well.
So I suspect the problem is, like, obviously what we're doing today doesn't work very well, right? Like, I mean, we have this issue where it just everything everybody's raising, and I wonder if the issue is that we're relying on the wrong person to make the decision. So right now, the decision is made by the cluster administrator, and people who just want to try things out, that means they basically need a special cluster to just try things out. And is there a way to make it the end user who makes the decision? It's not by default visible, and people have to take some explicit action to say and acknowledge I'm using a beta or alpha or preview or whatever it is API and feature, but they have the control over what otherwise looks like a normal cluster. I think this is a little bit like what Tim a few years ago talked about as like lenses, right? Like we can see we can pass some flag into cube control, and we can see the alpha fields or the beta fields based on some feature gate or something like that, right? Like, I think that something like that that's in the control of the end user and has visibility to the admin, such that if the user complains, oh, my thing's not working, they can say, well, yeah, you use this alpha feature, we don't support alpha features. But like, make it not such a rigid big switch that has to be controlled at the top level, but something people can play with. I mean, it's got risks, right? Because you could break other users. That's the biggest problem.
I think the admin has to act enabling the thing. I can only speak for GKE, but we let users turn on beta APIs for their cluster. Like, we plumb that through. It's a switch they have access to.
Yeah, but they have to do it at the like. Is it? It's not. If it in, yeah.
So they have the ability to do it. If they want to do it, they can. I don't.
But I'm an application author. I hear there's a new Kubernetes feature that would make my life a lot easier, my application run better. Now I have to go talk to my infrastructure team and say, hey, cluster admin, go enable this beta feature. And they're going to say no, because there's the other customers, and then I'm going to have to get a special thing cluster spun for me just to play with it.
What you're describing is what we did for the first 8 years of Kubernetes. And it meant that every integration that was out there integrated against unstable APIs. That's what happens. No matter how you qualify it,
I hear what you're saying.
Absolutely integrate with it and then say, here's the solution. It's on unstable APIs. See you later. We're going out of business now. You know,
I hear your point, but I guess the only difference is that I'm saying that putting V1 beta 1 in the API version of a manifest instead of V1 is too subtle. It's not explicit enough of an acknowledgement. It's not painful enough, right? Maybe it's too painful to have to do the feature gate and the API enablement, but having it on by default and just putting that field in there isn't painful enough. Is there somewhere in between?
I think
maybe there's not. I'm just trying to brainstorm here.
Responsible for the cluster explicitly opt in to unstable stuff being exposed and used and relied on seems like the right level. Like, are there ways we could make that maybe easier to, like, instead of opting into two things, you opt into one? Like, maybe so. But that the person responsible for the cluster acting things that are
They should
things I'm
definitely be able to
running
turn.
are relying on unstable stuff. That seems like the right level to me.
Well, they definitely should be able to say, I don't allow that in this cluster, right? But I'm just wondering if there's some middle ground here we're missing that's we're making it either too easy or too painful, and there's somewhere in the middle. But
so I wanted to say, I mean, John, you basically captured a lot of what I was going to say. In fact, I was going to cite my own previous ideas on this this lenses concept. I have found from my own experience, this is how Google's G Cloud command line mostly works. So I found it to be quite a good disincentive for not enabling beta stuff. Is when I say G Cloud, I have to say the equivalent would be kubectl -- enable beta, do something, and then that v1 beta 1 API group would work. And if I didn't, it would come back with a very clear, I was like, yo, that's a beta API, and you didn't tell me that you're willing to use beta APIs. And I guess that would translate into something in the request that would, the server side would know about. So if you're using an API client directly, you could say the moral equivalent of that. That feels like, here's a hurdle, but it's this high, not this high. I agree. I mean, I can't disagree with Jordan here. Even if we do this, people will abuse it, and they will build permanent structures on top of it.
And this logic is like baked into controllers, and like whatever hurdle or acknowledgement or like -- yes, I acknowledge this may stop working at any time equals true. Like whatever you put in there, integrations will absolutely bake into the guts of a controller, and then the controller will be in a container, and the container will be running in some poor user's cluster, and they will have no idea that the only reason this thing is working is because it like signed in blood that.
I mean, I agree with you that like the worst of our ecosystem will totally do that. I feel like the more we put it in people's faces, the better off we are. Maybe there's alerts or metrics or something that we provide to the cluster administrator that says, yo, people are using beta APIs, just so you know. I agree. I feel very sympathetic to the use case here, where if it had been easier to use, probably people would have tried it more, and instead we 10x'd the cost of the fix.
But the very act of trying it, people don't try things just for fun on the week. I mean, some people do. We do. But when someone tries something, what trying it means is I put stuff in production that depends on it. That's what that means. And so like the very thing that would have gotten us more feedback also would have put production use in play that now we're sort of like giving ourselves a pass for breaking if we need to.
I definitely agree.
I think there's a middle ground, but we've got some other hands here. Let's hear. I don't know I don't know what the order of hands is.
I think I was before Derek.
Okay.
So I was going to ask about the lens thing, and it actually related to this conversation. I don't think we 10x the cost of the fix, because I think that if this were on by default, because this is a platform extension, people would have unknowingly been using it. Like it's something that you installed an operator and it did this for you and it signed that checkbox for you. You never even saw it. Or one random person installed a Helm chart and you're using it, but you don't know that your usage of that API is dependent on a validating emission policy to make it safe. And so
a Helm chart wouldn't install, right? Unless when you ran Helm, you explicitly acknowledged. Now, if you had
that would be one person doing it, not the person using it. That's the person installing the CRD. That's not the person using it, right? So imagine installing, you're running like, I don't know, something from MySQL, right? Or something that installs a CRD into the cluster. One person says, oh, sure, I accept. And then everyone else is now using it and is unaware that it's load bearing on a a beta API. And so when we get into that situation, I know we would have had, well, I guess being the guy that would have to sign off on it either way, it's an API machinery. I would have had almost exactly the same conversation, right? Okay, there are going to be people who are using this. It exists in production. How are we going to be sure that their pieces keep working and we close the gap as best we can in the future? I think it would have looked the same. And yeah, I mean, I guess that's my primary point. Oh, and then the other one is perhaps there's a difference between a platform extension feature where you end up in that case where one person installs the Helm chart and everyone uses it, and something that exists inside of the workload, like inside of a deployment, where you end up going and saying like, okay, in my namespace, I'm creating this thing. Perhaps in that case, some sort of client-side acknowledgement would to some degree help, but for a platform extension, I don't think it will.
Yeah, this is kind of the same topic as Tim's, so we're kind of bleeding in. I think who's next, Derek?
Yeah, I was just going to say the middle ground in my head is like if I zoom out to the broader cloud native ecosystem, like first, we're very good in Kubernetes on actually having meaning on that v1 alpha 1, v1 beta 1 API version field that is hidden away in the manifest. The rest of the ecosystem, like it's a shocking number of like APIs labeled as alpha that are in broad use. So like the conventions that we're trying to establish here, they're not being followed elsewhere. So it's already confusing users. If you see an alpha label in an Argo API, it has a different meaning than an alpha label in a Kube API. So I can kind of empathize with the broader user community generally, I guess. David touched on what I was going to say there, which is like the middle ground to me is a Helm chart. The user chooses to install it. Like they don't have to go and interface at the service provider layer. Like they can have a kube config and deploy something to the control plane they point to. I imagine in the GKE scenario, you can't turn on beta features via a kube config and a kubectl. You have to go and probably touch a service provider API. And I don't know if the friction that's being noted here is that I have a kube config and I'm cluster admin inside my cluster versus I'm actually service instance admin and I can see the cluster record in a managed service interface. And to me, the line there is a little different. Personally, I sympathize with David, which is I don't think there's an easy answer here generally. It could mean that some folks more naturally could get beta feedback on their API if they wanted to publish like a Helm chart that said this is how you could deploy it if it fit neatly into a new resource and controller. But I recognize that doesn't work with, beta fields and existing APIs. But maybe my question to the group is, are folks wanting to make it that if I have a cluster admin kube config that I should be able to try out the feature, and the friction that's too high is I need to actually have visibility maybe into a managed service UX to turn the feature on and off? Because I guess from my perspective, I don't agree that a user who has cluster admin kube configs should be able to necessarily do this. So I guess I kind of agree with where the present art is with Jordan.
And I guess trying to elaborate on why you might think that way, Derek, I'm trying to put myself in your shoes. You're thinking that because enablement of certain beta APIs, which, for example, let's say we did make a breaking change, enabling those beta APIs, or worse yet, the alpha APIs, may make it unsafe to upgrade your cluster without disruption. So for instance, if you were depending on validating the mission policy, it did not promote, you were able to enable it as a cluster admin. Well, now as a service provider, I'm stuck. Do I upgrade you and screw up your integration, or do I leave you at the old level?
Yeah, to some degree, there's the tension as a managed service provider or any infrastructure team providing infrastructure for the users, is that there's a blurry SLA boundary there that's being held, and
I wonder if,
both parties need some control, right? There's a shared responsibility at play.
I wonder if maybe we can categorize, maybe there could be an effort to categorize some of the different types of features. Like if what we're talking about are features that are added to namespaced APIs, like I could imagine, I think somebody linked to something with Daniel proposed in the past, which might have been, I didn't follow the link, so I don't know, but might have been like namespaced enablement of feature gates. Like there might be cases that we can change how we do it, such that we can do it safely. I mean, it may be that platform extensions, like David's saying, we can't do it safely with, like ever. But there might be cases where some of the features we're adding could have more flexibility in how they're tried out. I don't know yet the details. I don't think it's useful to just say, no, never, it's not going to happen, we're just stuck. Like, I think that we should spend a little effort to problem solve, like, are there at least cases where we can do a better job? And lower the bar, but not lower it so low that we end up back where we were a few years ago. But somebody would have to lead that effort. I don't know whose hand is next.
I think Tim A is next.
Sorry, I forgot to put my hand on.
So I guess I'm next. Weirdly, if we were consistent with fields and API groups, I would find this less awful, because at least then we would be acknowledging, like, we're just not going to get feedback on beta. Like, that is the truth, right? But today it's this weird mixed thing, which gives weird incentives to extend existing APIs rather than structure them in a way that might be more natural. So, I mean, I guess I'm sort of arguing we should get off the fence on it.
So you're
saying you'd be okay with, in concept, saying, you know what, we're going to fix this the other way around. No more beta fields and GA types.
I mean, I think it would have consequences that are hard for us to imagine today, but I think it would at least be consistent.
I am normally the king of, like, consistency above all else. But in practice, I have not seen beta fields being added causing nearly the same kinds of issues. Like, not even close. Like, I think new fields and existing types are generally way more conservative and iterative in the behavior changes they're introducing. And in the happy path, where you have a feature and then it adds a field and the field goes through alpha, beta, GA. Like, in the happy path, like, there is no integration that's disrupted by the graduation to GA. In the happy path for API endpoints, like, the endpoint changes, so the integrations are disrupted. So I don't think they are identical, and I wouldn't try to make them consistent by, and unless we can point to, like, tons of disruption and beta field problems that I haven't seen. Maybe that exists, but I haven't seen it.
No, I mean, I think you're right. There's not a huge corpus of explosions that we can point to that are caused by field additions. Certainly, there are field additions that are going through unnatural actions to try to fit into existing APIs, but they haven't really exploded in the same way. I did want to point to one thing that you said, though, about the API, the endpoint changing. If we did lenses the way that I described them, the API endpoint wouldn't change, actually. It would become a parameter, not part of the API endpoint. I'm allowing beta. This is GA, this is V1 plus beta fields. The beta fields being, do you want them or not? So the integrations need not break unless they were using beta fields that were then changed, right? If we change it from an int to a string, yeah, they would break. But
I
it's
guess
very
that
hand waving. It's not a fully fleshed out design.
actually works. Whether it's a parameter or I don't understand how it is that like opportunistically non-breaking? Like it's non-breaking if we can make it non-breaking, but if it's going to be breaking, we'll just break you.
Yeah, pretty much. I mean, but that's the same as fields, right? If I introduce a field named foo and it's a string and I later change it to an int, if I use the name foo, it's a breaking change. If I use foo string or foo int, then it's not a breaking change, except it is because foo went away anyway.
And we don't allow changes like that.
Well, I mean, if you use a name, that name is tombstone forever.
Sure.
Right? Or is locked to that type forever. I suppose in theory, it could be woken up later with the same type with a different meaning, but I don't think we've ever done that.
Yeah.
Anyway, it's a hand waving idea. It's totally not fleshed out. It's an enormous project if we were to try to tackle something like that. I'm not sure it rises to the level of the problem that we have here.
Like I'm trying to imagine some of the notable changes we've made going from beta to GA. If we had been constrained to not making any schema changes from the beta. So like custom resource definitions, single version went to multiple versions. Like what would that have looked like if with a lenses thing where we said, oh, people using the beta need to keep getting the single version beta forever, and now this is overlaid on the GA, so we can't actually make the GA schema sensible. I have a hard time picturing like the extra constraints that something like that would put on us.
Can I ask a somewhat obvious question here, which is like, who actually wants this, right? So like, as a user, do I want to consume unstable APIs? Probably not, unless I really, 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 really felt I needed them in that narrow case. And then there's as the community developers in the Kubernetes project, do we actually want to support unstable APIs? Probably really don't either, but we got some feedback. I guess what I'm wondering here is like, it feels like a pretty narrow population, right? And maybe as CC, as someone who went through the process, like if the API was on by default, but you had to support them with all the mistakes you made in beta, would you have been happy with that? Or do you still want to be able to, move on from those mistakes? But I think it's important to go back and just kind of ask, like, who is it that actually wants the change? Do we want the change more than the users are seeking it? Does that make sense?
You asked CC. I'll let CC go first, but I had something to say after that.
I heard you like you're asking if even if we make the beta on by default, then like the way we handle the fakes probably should be the same as like we handle GA. Is that the point?
Yeah, pretty much. Like in general, I don't think a lot of users want to use unstable APIs. Like they accidentally use them and then find themselves in jeopardy. And so then there's a narrow set of users who are actively seeking the function that's being developed. And then there's the narrow set of developers who are building said function who want some feedback. But I guess what I'm wondering is at the end of the day, like, do the narrow set of developers who are building the function and want the feedback, do they actually want to carry support burdens for the APIs when they're on? Or do we want the freedom to just say we messed up and we're going to work on it, get better? Because if we're not willing to support the APIs for the narrow set of users who are seeking them, then like no one's happy, if that makes sense. Like it feels like everybody wants to have I give up, I want to be able to clear the slate reset moment, right? Does that make sense?
Makes sense to me, but I think it's Tim. I have
Yeah.
Jim's is next in line. Then I have some comments. I
Uh,
like where you're going, Derek. But
Derek, you said a lot of stuff that that I've seen. Like one example comes to mind is the number of people who have asked like the in-place upgrades, in-place vertical auto scaling, whatever, right? It's not really. It's it's marked beta, but not beta. It's well, they want it, right? Like so they really want it and they want to turn it on and they want to use it, and then that's not going to be the enough, right? So once they find a bug, then they're going to say, hey, fix it for me, right? And we can't go around doing that in a large scale environment, right? So then it becomes a problem. But there is one more thing here is we've had trouble just explaining to people what the policy means, and they keep getting confused between feature gates and APIs. And like we have to say, look, it's APIs is APIs, not the feature gate. So what we've ended up doing on the EKS side is we're just going to do exactly what is upstream is doing. If you want to know if a feature gate is on or off, go check the upstream code, right? And like if the API is on or off, go check the upstream code. We're going to do exactly the same. We're not going to touch any of the feature gates or the APIs above and beyond what is there in upstream, right? Like, so that is our defense right now. But then if we go back to doing allowing beta APIs, then it's going to be like, okay, we got to figure out like how to switch them off. And then there's going to be divergence between what is in upstream and what is in a cloud provider, for example, right?
yeah, I think that I actually think that talking about feature gates versus APIs is it's not the real problem. I think it gets back to more what Derek was saying is that we don't want to support things that are unstable. We don't want users to rely on things that are unstable. And users, if they were aware they were relying on things that were unstable, probably would be pretty unhappy about it. They do it by accident. So what we really want is we want to get feedback on new features. And that's the gap. That's it. That's the total gap, that feedback loop. And I guess maybe some soak time, but I don't know that we can realistically expect that from the world. That's something we have to do ourselves. So, I mean, I guess I would step back maybe and see, is there just a totally different way to address that problem? Like in a traditional product, we used to sell appliances, right? There was no, it was like, how did we do that? We had a handful of customers and we would give them special builds and it's very hands-on and we work with them and we, have them try it out and we run through scenarios with them and we make sure that it meets their needs. And it's a huge pain, right? But I don't know of any other better way to get feedback. And part of the problem with a lot of our open source work is unless it's motivated by some internal PM at some company, it's really hard to do that. So I don't know. I'm maybe not offering any solutions here, but I'm just wondering if there's a way we can step back and think about what it is we actually want. And is there a process solution as opposed to a technical solution or some technical solutions to sort of support a more process type solution that we might want to go for instead of, I think all the things people are bringing up kind of indicate that no technical solution is going to really be satisfactory.
Is feedback code for, we would like you to spend the time learning how to use this, start using it, ship it, deploy it in your platform extension for your customers, tell us whether it's broken, and then the reward for doing all those good things for us is, don't worry, we're going to fix that, and now you're incompatible. Is that what we mean?
I don't think we can expect that. Like, I think that's way too much to expect. Like, that's what I mean when I say
I'm
like
on the same page as to what you mean by feedback.
Yeah. I don't think we can expect more than very limited feedback from people. That's just my experience, right? Like the feedback will primarily be in form of in the form of the UX. Is it usable? Is it expressive enough? Is it too painful? And the feedback on, yeah, you might find a few bugs here and there as people like used in their labs. Feedback is labs, it's not production. You're not going to get people to put things, I mean, unless they're like in desperate need, like Derek was saying, of some particular feature because of some problem in their production environment that can only be solved by that feature. Sure, then they'll enable it and they'll deal with the consequences if they have to undo it later. But for the vast majority of features we do, which are like functional things, I just don't see ever getting anybody to invest that kind of effort.
Okay, I agree, and it sounds like we both see the issue. It is a tough sell. Sorry, Dims, I saw your hand went down. I did not mean to demotivate you.
Oh, no, no, no. I had forgotten to lower my hand.
I
was
Is Tim or
Joe's
Joe?
next.
okay. Yeah, I was going to ask a similar question, which is, in this case, being one of the first off by default for beta APIs, should we have done more to gather feedback? Is there guidance that we should give to the next API that goes through this process that's different than what we give today that would help them? Or should we be more focusing on like, how do you fix things in GA? How do you make that better?
So that's kind of what I'm suggesting, Joe, is that I don't know what you did. So this isn't really meant as a criticism. It's more in a traditional non-open source world, like you do that with design partners, with customer advisory boards, with super hands-on, effortful work with customers who have specific challenges you're trying to address, and you see if what you've come up with works for them. And if it doesn't, it never gets to the rest of your customers. You go back to the drawing board, you figure it out. They never put it in production unless, it's a much more hands-on effort, and it's a little bit hard to do, but that's the kind of thing I would expect would help.
Yeah, I mean, without getting into the details of what actual issues we hit here, I think one of them we may have caught if we'd pushed a little harder on people to test out specific features. Maybe. I'm still not 100% on that, but it's possible. So I have this gut feeling that maybe if we had set more stringent requirements for ourselves, but I'm just not sure how to codify that for the next API graduator, how to help them forward and give guidance.
Tim, I'm going to have to drop off. Somebody else is going to have to take over moderating here, but Tim, go ahead.
Yeah, we've only got a 10-ish minutes left, so we can't possibly do the other topic real justice. But one of the questions I would want to ask with the topic of stagnation is, how can we what movement can we make to ensure that Kubernetes remains able to do things, to solve problems? Because what I see is increasingly we don't get feedback. We're doing well-intentioned safety things, which means that getting a new API out is harder. Getting anything done is getting slower. Compatibility trumps all, which is an argument that I have been on the same side of as I think everybody here. But I'm also seeing an increasing unwillingness of people to even engage. I'm seeing people who are like, it's too much of a pain. I don't want to deal with Kubernetes. I'll work around it, or I'll do something horrible. And I don't see that faring well for the project. I mean, great, we're boring, we're stable, we are, we should be hard to change. I hear people saying it already. And yet that is a feedback loop that ends in death. And so, like, my question is really, what can we do to stop hurting ourselves so much? And I have a second part of the question, which is about sort of partner projects, but we don't have time to cover that now.
So Yeah, I think there's always a risk when you make it so hard to change that people then just work around you, and then we lose things like conformance no longer apply, and we have a proliferation of different options. In some cases, that like it's all a fuzzy line because right, sometimes you want that million projects in the CNCF sandbox so people could try stuff out, and one comes out the winner. Does it ever move back into Kubernetes? Maybe, probably not, but I don't know. It's yeah.
When you say outside of Kubernetes, you didn't just mean outside of core, you meant outside of the Kube ecosystem. Did I read
Well,
that right,
that's
Tim?
even worse. But I no,
Yeah, people are
'Cause the
still people are
ecosystem,
going.
yeah.
I see people going around us all over the place to just get things done without having to deal with the sort of unfortunate truism that getting anything done in Kubernetes is a 1.5-year project.
Yeah, I don't know how to balance that, Tim, with all the production users that we have today, right? That's the biggest conundrum at this point, right? Simple example is 130, we hardened something, which in JWT, if you remember, where issuer OIDC and the other one, if it matched the same, then we were going to break something. So that hit us just yesterday. So we were like, okay, what do we do here? Because somebody changed something in Terraform, and I'll explain more. I know Jordan is curious about it, so I'll explain that later on Slack. But that is one example of like, hey, we know that is a wrong config, so we added a check to say, look, this is not a valid config, but then it actually hit people in production. So that is one example of like, things that we might break.
I think we pointed that out in our talk at KubeCon, Dims. Every feature or misfeature is in use by somebody somewhere. Unless you can prove otherwise, you have to assume it's true.
Yeah. Bye, John.
Would more releases per year help, Tim? Right. So that doesn't let you remove things earlier, but it does let you gather feedback if people will actually use it. Oh, people won't use the feedback anyway. Yeah. Okay.
I mean, yeah, we're not getting feedback, right? We're putting up blocks to the few mechanisms that we have to get feedback, because this feedback is a balancing act between people using it and depending on it. If it works, they're going to depend on it. It's true. And if it doesn't work, then they're going to stop giving us feedback. And yet people really only give feedback on things that don't work. So even when things do work, we don't really hear about it.
It's the people for whom it works because of a bug or misfeature that
That's right.
I'm terrified of.
Totally, I completely agree. And if this was a trick and I had an answer up my sleeve, I would have already shown it. I see it spiraling in a bad way right now. More releases per year, I'm not sure would actually solve the problem. It would make some things like introducing a new field go a little bit faster, but it would actually cause pain on people in other places.
Yeah, if you can do skip releases, if you can skip releases, then it'll probably help a little bit more. But I think, Tim, one thing that I'm seeing is like the end users who don't care about the code or like, what exactly we do here and us here, we are losing the people in the middle, right? Like who can deploy the thing in production, make changes if they want to, and then come back and tell us, okay, this didn't work, that didn't work. We are losing the people in the middle. Like that's the way I feel. I don't know if that resonates.
I mean, I'm not sure there are that many people in the middle. I think it's people who are unwilling to try anything new. Please let me know when it's done, sort of people. And there's a very, very small number of people who are willing to go out and try new things to see if it fits. And this is how we, eventually find like you said, this OIDC case where, why are you doing that? When maybe there's a reason, or maybe you just did it wrong in the first place. we can't know those things. So my biggest worry for the project right now is this stagnation, that we become unable to solve real problems because doing anything just takes too long, too
So,
hard.
Tim, the reverse question, right? Like, is this if we revert the policy on the beta, is that enough to turn the tide? Probably not, right?
No, I don't think so.
Yeah, so it's a larger problem than just this
Yeah,
specific
I
question.
segued this into the second topic
Right.
by force of will. I have the secondary concern around stagnation is with our partner projects. The reason I actually added this to the agenda in the first place was some conversations about Containerd 2 and their seemingly reasonable desire to deprecate things that are really, really old and they don't want to support anymore, and how that impacts us and our users, and what can we reasonably ask them to do or not do, versus what do we have to just accept as like that's out of our control.
Yeah. Can you cite an example, Tim, of what is breaking?
For example, Containerd 2, the topic at hand was they wanted to change default. I'm trying to even remember what the field was, but they wanted to change the default of some field that was at the other end of a CRI call, because it made sense for Containerd users to have, I think it was a secure thing. Like, it's like be secure by default. Well, the Kubernetes default was insecure because that's the backwards compatible position, and we added a field which you have to opt into security, which is awful, but that is the compatible way to do it. And they committed a change that changed it, and it would have broken our users, and we had to ask them to please not change that semantic, which they were willing to do, to full credit. But then they raised the point that there are other things. There are really old aspects of like pre-OCI Docker images that they think are perfectly reasonable things to get rid of. They've been deprecated for 5 years, right? Are we okay with that? Are we sure that there's no image out there in any Kubernetes cluster that was built prior to 2017 that would stop working after this Containerd change, right? I have no data to which I can point to make that assumption.
Right.
In fact, your OECD thing exactly opposite indicates the exact opposite. Probably there is, and I don't know how to again overcome that. And I don't know if we can reasonably impose, hey, Containerd, we depend on you, therefore you can never fix your own problems.
Yeah, it's the same thing with us at Golang too, right? Like we want more guarantees than.
Oh yeah, look how much pain the Go project caused in changing the way IPs were parsed. Like, we still years later have a tangle of code that we don't know how to unwind because of that decision.
The only constant is change, so we have to figure out a way to change slowly, which is what we are doing right now. But that's the cost.
Right. And at some point, people look at our problems and they go, forget it. I'm not going to deal with this.
Right.
So Tim, I'm trying to think, like, in my mind, there are areas that we need to make sure the Kubernetes project can move at the pace of the industry, where the industry is moving a little quicker than maybe Cube is. But that doesn't mean that all of Cube needs to move at that pace. And so I guess what I'm wondering is if you have any nuance to your thinking on this. Like, for example, like in my mind, it's a bad outcome if users who want to do inferencing and training need to like fracture the platform. And so when I think about the types of things that make people want to use newer builds of Linux, let's say it's because they have new hardware with new toys. And new versions of Linux make that sing a little bit better. And in Cube, we hit that at different levels. Like you were talking about what Containerd can let go, but then we have the inverse of like, well, when do we do cgroups v2 only, or when can we say older versions of kernels don't work, that type of thing.
Mhm.
But I guess as a project posture, to me, I would want to have a more nuanced perspective on this. Like, I would love a world where things like DRA could move much faster than necessarily, RBAC, APIs in the cluster, right? So, um, and that seems a little more grounded in the reality of it. I guess I would see the environment we're in. So I guess, are you looking for a one size fits all approach, or are you open to like a more nuanced perspective on like where we recognize we need to move faster, we could bend but not break the whole project, if that makes sense?
I mean, good call out considering that I'm spending every minute that I'm not in a meeting, I'm spending on DRA right now.
Exactly.
And it's exceedingly painful to make happen. And I'm not sure what would need to change to make it happen faster. It's just a really hard problem domain to try to get right. Some of the alpha beta stuff maybe would be better. I haven't really put a lot of thought in that. I think the nuance is appropriate. There are some things that shouldn't change quickly, like authorization policy should be very careful and meticulous. But I don't know exactly how to characterize like what's reasonable and what's not to expect to move faster. It's a good question.
Yeah, I was so happy to see the two working groups form, Tim. Coming back from Paris was really energizing because of all the discussions there and like the follow-ups that happened really quickly after that. So definitely
Yeah.
plus to that.
I mean, we have a cultural problem of getting ahead of the curve. Like, frankly speaking, like we screwed up, and we here is in large part me, who is a reviewer for DRA. We screwed up 2 years ago when we were like, yeah, it's fine, whatever. We didn't really pay much attention to it because it didn't seem like something that was critically urgent. And now here we are acting, your hair's on fire, right?
Yeah.
And frankly, we may miss another release and we may be another 6 months out. And this goes to the more releases per year question, which I have feelings about, but we'll leave offline here. I guess we're almost at time, so I'll hand it back to Jordan, who's got his hand up patiently.
A pattern that I've seen work well for unavoidably breaking changes, not just ones that we wanted to clean some stuff up, so we broke stuff, but unavoidable changes like the IP parsing thing or something in containerd that we can't control, is if we're going to make a change like this, it has to be detectable. And we need some window, at least a release, ideally multiple releases, where you can tell if your particular cluster has the data or the containers or the usage or the whatever via a metric or a thing, and it's very clear what you have to do to remedy the issue so that it's safe to upgrade. Like that pattern, I think, is reasonable to push for everywhere we control or we have visibility to a change like that. Clear documentation, clear signals, so that you know your particular cluster is safe or not, and what you need to do to fix it. And then at some point, yeah, maybe the change just has to come, and like we have to parse IPs a new way, and we say before you upgrade, you need to make sure you have a clean signal here. That pattern is one I would like to see us evangelize and follow.
I guess the one thing I was curious about is we have feature flags and we have well, yeah, we'll just poke on feature flags, I guess, here. The thing I was wrestling in my head, Tim, and I'm curious if you've wrestled on it, would be like for if you knew, let's say, kubelets or runtimes were only ever going to run on new hardware, would we ever want to produce like two binaries of kubelets, the faster moving kubelet and the slower moving kubelet, right? Or if we had different ways of signaling to the users that this is the known good thing to do when you're rolling out new hardware versus supporting software that's on 3-year-old hardware, like is there a nuance there that we could benefit from, where that you're not having to carry forward a bunch of like pre-existing legacy clusters that are having to upgrade through all of time?
I mean, it is a great question, but I think the answer is absolutely yes. There's a bunch of things even that we could say, if you're turning on a new cluster, the defaults will be this. Like, we won't allow you to use IPs with leading zeros, and that will fail at the API. And that's cool. And if you turn on a new cluster, it'll behave that way. But we can't do it for old clusters. I mean, for what it's worth, that is basically the strategy that we're looking at for this particular problem, combined with a whole lot of warnings and very incremental steps. I don't have a good answer in my head at all about how to codify that. Like, a lot of the machinery that we have around API and defaults is very static and doesn't have the configuration that we would want. And I'm not sure how we would even explain like semantics being different in different clusters. Maybe that's an avenue worth exploring more, though. I mean, I like it, Derek.
It's the only avenue I could think of that matches what I see in the Linux world.
Yeah.
Right. And so I was trying to think about other parallel universes that struggle with this problem. And like the Linux world does not struggle with this atrophy because people get new hardware. But right now we haven't found a great way of reconciling the Kubernetes world with a hardware cycle. And so that's what I was just trying to think through. Like in the current AI moment, people are making massive investments in new hardware. It's almost like, would there be a natural expectation that somehow we could reflect this iteration of Kubernetes as the right one for this level of hardware?
Some of this could be captured in API versioning. Like I've said before, joking but not really joking, that we should do a core V2 where the only change is changing defaults of things that we think are bad between V1 and V2. No structural changes, no deprecations, just change defaults. And if you submit your pod through the V2 API, you'll get all the secure options on by default. And why don't we do that? Because it's such an enormous undertaking to just clone and rev the API that nobody's going to deal with that. That's an us hurting ourselves problem. It should be, in a perfect world, it should be 2 hours of work to make a core V2 where you only encode the deltas from V1. But that's not how our code base works.
Okay, we'll have to leave it at that. We are 5 minutes over. Thanks a lot, everyone. See you all in 2 weeks. Bye.
Thanks, everyone. Good luck on your caps.